friends, welcome back to Quiza.
Today we are with you with a Guess the 101 Pokémons by Picture challenge. Before starting, please subscribe to your channel. Are you ready, friends? Let's go. Who's that Pokémon? Bulbasaur. Who's that Pokémon? Charmander. Who's that Pokémon? Pikachu. Who's that Pokémon? Squirtle. Who's that Pokémon? Eevee. Who's that Pokémon? Rattata. Who's that Pokémon? Charizard. Who's that Pokémon? Magikarp. Who's that Pokémon? Mew. Who's that Pokémon? Blastoise. Who's that Pokémon? Pidgey. Who's that Pokémon? Snorlax. Who's that Pokémon? Gengar. Who's that Pokémon? Mewtwo. Who's that Pokémon? Dragonite. Who's that Pokémon? Jigglypuff. Who's that Pokémon? Meow. Who's that Pokémon? Venusaur. Who's that Pokémon? Lapras. Who's that Pokémon? Alakazam. Who's that Pokémon? Clefairy. Who's that Pokémon? Psyduck. Who's that Pokémon? Vaporeon. Who's that Pokémon? Jolteon. Who's that Pokémon? Flareon. Who's that Pokémon? Machamp. Who's that Pokémon? Geodude. Who's that Pokémon? Gyarados. Who's that Pokémon? Raichu. Who's that Pokemon? Arcanine. Who's that Pokemon? Diglett. Who's that Pokemon? Ninetales. Who's that Pokemon? Charmeleon. Who's that Pokemon? Ivysaur. Who's that Pokemon? Wartortle. Who's that Pokemon? Nidoking. Who's that Pokemon? Nidoqueen. Who's that Pokemon? Onix. Who's that Pokemon? Arbok. Who's that Pokemon? Zapdos. Who's that Pokemon? Moltres. Who's that Pokemon? Articuno. Who's that Pokemon? Zubat. Who's that Pokemon? Ditto. Who's that Pokemon? Chansey. Who's that Pokemon? Growlithe. Who's that Pokemon? Ekans. Who's that Pokemon? Dratini. Who's that Pokemon? Mr. Mime. Who's that Pokemon? Butterfree. Who's that Pokemon? Pidgeot. Who's that Pokemon? Voltorb. Who's that Pokemon? Cubone. Who's that Pokemon? Nidoran female. Who's that Pokemon? Oh, Raticate. Who's that Pokemon? Vulpix. Who's that Pokemon? Nidoran male. Who's that Pokemon? Oh, Golbat. Who's that Pokemon? Doug Trio. Who's that Pokemon? Caterpie. Who's that Pokemon? Persian. Who's that Pokemon? Coughing. Who's that Pokemon? Magnemite. Who's that Pokemon? Ghastly. Who's that Pokemon? Marowak. Who's that Pokemon? Starmie. Who's that Pokemon? Metapod. Who's that Pokemon? Abra. Who's that Pokemon? Pidgeotto. Who's that Pokemon? Sandshrew. Who's that Pokemon? Weedle. Who's that Pokemon? Clefable. Who's that Pokemon? Machop. Who's that Pokemon? Tentacle. Who's that Pokemon? Golem. Who's that Pokemon? Ponyta. Who's that Pokemon? Haunter. Who's that Pokemon? Magneton. Who's that Pokemon? Beedrill. Who's that Pokemon? Wigglytuff. Who's that Pokemon? Kadabra. Who's that Pokemon? Electrode. Who's that Pokemon? Hitmonlee. Who's that Pokemon? Jinx. Who's that Pokemon? Magmar. Who's that Pokemon? Porygon. Who's that Pokemon? Rhydon. Who's that Pokemon? Kakuna. Who's that Pokemon? Nidorino. Who's that Pokemon? Sandslash. Who's that Pokemon? Dragonair. Who's that Pokemon? Aerodactyl. Who's that Pokemon? Scyther. Who's that Pokemon? Staryu. Who's that Pokemon? Slowbro. Who's that Pokemon? Hitmonchan. Who's that Pokemon? Electabuzz. Who's that Pokemon? Muk. Who's that Pokemon? Rapidash. Who's that Pokemon? Weezing. Who's that Pokemon? Tentacruel.
Thanks for watching.